Good evening, everybody. My name's E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Kirkus Circle. Kirkus Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Kirkus Books, and Kirkus Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are coming to you live, respectively, from Atlanta and Chicago. We wish that we were gathered physically together in the space of Kirkus Books, but we're really glad to have all of you in the chat shouting out where you're watching from. Really, the best part of the pandemic for us has been getting to gather with folks from all over the world who like to connect around important books and feminist topics. So this is a really special evening, and we have two incredible folks that we're excited to introduce to you. So first, I want to thank our co-host for tonight. The Auburn Avenue Research Library has been an incredible partner during this time. The Auburn Avenue Research Library on African American culture and history is really a jewel in our city. And although they are not open to public browsing for COVID safety, they are very much open online. They have incredible resources, and we really encourage you to take advantage of this time when the research librarians are present and ready to help you do your work in the world, to check them out. So we have a research librarian on the chat who's going to be dropping extra links both about Ida B. Wells and other parts of the collection, so that you can go back and learn more. It's going to be a lot of links, so we want you to know these links are going to stay up. So don't feel the pressure to investigate them all right now. You're going to want to pay attention to the conversation and then go back at the end and check out all the links, because there's going to just be a rich wealth of things to check out. The other thing I want to let you know is that you can buy Ida B. the Queen, The Extraordinary Life and Legacy of Ida B. Wells from Kirkus Books at any time via this teal link at the bottom center of your screen. You may also pop a question in the Ask a Question box at any time at the bottom of your screen. And about 2/3 of the way through the evening, we will begin, starting to take those questions, but feel free to put them in at any point, and that'll help us sort of gauge how many questions there are. So please feel free. It's not disruptive at all. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Catherine Meeks first. Catherine Meeks is the retired Clara Carter Acree Distinguished Professor of Sociocultural Studies at Wesleyan College and the director of the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing. She has long been a strong advocate for social justice, community, and wellness. She is the author of several books, including Living into God's Dream and Passionate for Justice, Ida B. Wells as Prophet for Our Time. So welcome, Dr. Catherine Meeks. We're thrilled to have you back at Kirkus. Dr. Meeks is one of our last events last year in the real physical space of Kirkus prior to the pandemic. So we were just saying it feels a little like a time warp to be back together. And we're here tonight to celebrate the work and the book of Michelle Duster. Michelle is a writer, speaker, professor, and champion of racial and gender equity. In the last dozen years, she has written, edited, or contributed to 11 books. She co-wrote the popular children's history book, Tate and His Historic Dream, co-edited Shifts, and Michelle Obama's Impact on African American Women and Girls, and edited 2 books that include the writings of her great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells. She has written articles for Essence, Refinery 29, HuffPost, Teen Vogue, and the North Star. So welcome, Michelle. We're so thrilled to have you here tonight.
Thank you, ER. I appreciate this.
So I'm gonna get out of the way and let Dr. Meeks take it away for us.
All right. Well, what a delight. Well, again, Michelle, it's so great to meet you. I mean, after our conversations on the phone and trying to work out you're coming to be with us at the Center for Racial Healing, and then to have COVID just change our plans completely. So I'm really delighted that we get to be here together tonight. And I want to say, before I say anything else, how much I love this book. It is just absolutely a delight. I sat down with it and I didn't move for 4 hours going through it. And I love the layout and the kind of feel. It's almost like you're on this adventure with the photographs and the ways in which they've laid it out, that it feels like reading a good newspaper or a good magazine, and it's just beautiful. So thank you for putting this together and giving us this lovely treasure to have.
Oh, thank you so much, Catherine. I'm so glad you enjoyed the book because
Yeah.
it is very different than most books that are about my great-grandmother. Not
Yes.
only because I wrote it,
Right.
but also the structure, as you mentioned, is nonlinear, and it incorporates people who are in the present, in our current life here with, and I wanted to tie what is happening today with the work and the legacy of my great-grandmother, so people can see a continuum of the struggle
Yeah.
for racial and gender equity.
Well, and I think that it might be really nice for the audience to hear you say a little bit about the impact of your great grandmother upon you. If you maybe you could read a little bit from that section for us, and then we'll talk about it, and then we'll get into why you wrote this book this way and why you called it Ida B the Queen. I mean, I've got all these questions, and I want to try to sequence them in some way so that people won't get lost in our conversation. So I wonder if you would just read a little bit and then we'll go from there.
Right, so I'm reading a snippet of the chapter that I wrote about my experience as a descendant of Ida B. Wells. I do want to say that I grew up as one of 15 grandchildren of my grandmother was Ida's youngest daughter. So I wrote, by the time I got to high school, Ida's autobiography, which my grandmother edited and got published in 1970, had been out for several years. That was her thing, as far as I was concerned. I was too busy living my own life to pay attention to what my grandmother did. I was involved in the school orchestra, track team, yearbook staff, newspaper staff, French club, all-city band, and an all-city teenage newspaper. My world was about me and my friends. And then reporters started coming by the house. My world started to include banquets and ceremonies where Ida was inducted into halls of fame or featured in exhibits. Buildings were named after her. People wanted to make movies or write books about her. My father had always told us stories of his childhood, which was filled with financial struggle. He grew up during the Depression with my grandmother, who was widowed with 5 children to take care of. They both wanted us to be proud of our heritage, but felt no pressure to match Ida's accomplishments. We were encouraged to develop our own interests and skills. As a result, I felt slightly disconnected from all of the hoopla. We were taught to have our own identities, to not speak much about our relation to Ida B. Wells, because we did not do any of her work. She did. People outside of our family tied their expectations of us to Ida more than was emphasized within our own family. Ida lived her life, and I could live mine.
Oh, that's so lovely. And as people purchase the book and read, they'll get to hear a little more about, and maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that too as we go forward. But as you look back on that, do you think, as you look back on that early part of your life and the kind of way your great grandmother was handled in your family, would you do that differently if or do you think it could have been done another way, would have had a different impact upon you, or was the way your parents handled who she was exactly, just as you look back on it, the right way, or would you have wished for them to do it differently?
I actually very much appreciate the way that that her legacy was handled in our family, because she had such an amazing number of accomplishments. It could be intimidating, to hear all of that and to feel any sense of like you are expected to do the same. And so that could be overwhelming for a child to try to, think that that's what's expected. So I appreciate how my grandmother really, when I look back on it, she focused her energy on us. As far as, to me, she was a grandmother. She came to our, little concerts, our little school plays, and we would have every, holiday and birthdays and barbecues. Like, to me, it seemed like we were like everybody else. I felt that my grandmother really focused on being a grandmother and not like this, we're going to sit here and make sure that you know what your great grandmother did and you are expected to do the same thing.
Right. Could make you a little neurotic, couldn't it? If she had gone down that route of these are the expectations. I mean, the expectation for you to be the best person you can be. That seems like what the message was. That
Absolutely.
there's this legacy here, but your job is to be the best person you can be. And I think that's wonderful.
I mean, I also really want to emphasize my mother's role because I am related to Ida B. Wells through my father. He was my father's grandmother. But my mother had a totally different family history. And my mother was very, very adamant about making sure that her family's experience was considered equally important. And I appreciate that because so there wasn't this like, we're going to have, Ida B. Wells on this, pedestal kind of thing, and everybody else doesn't matter. We all matter. And I think because of the way my mother comes from a farming community. And so there was that legacy of self-determination through land ownership. And I think that is very important when it comes to the history of Black people and having a sense of, in your own way, you're resisting.
Right. Absolutely.
Resisting.
Absolutely. And not to create that kind of hierarchy of competition in your own family, but to have you grow up appreciating both sides of that coin those were wise people, weren't they? Yeah. So why Ida B. the Queen? Why that title?
Oh, well, I mean, one of the things is that I discovered a poem that was written about Ida called Queen of Her Race. It was written by one of her contemporaries after she integrated the suffrage parade in 1913. And so the fact that her own contemporaries during her time referred to her that way, made it seem like it wasn't hyperbolic, but that we can, celebrate her today in that way.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I'd love the title, and I think it's right on. But I thought I really want to see what that was about. And then, can you just say a little bit about why this particular kind of book that? And you started to say a little bit about that in the beginning here, but with the kind of the contemporary story and the historical story kind of marching together. And you're kind of marching along, and then here's this figure that you know because that was somebody that lived in my time, and yet you're talking about folks who have also come and gone. So what did you want to achieve by having this kind of offering on Ida B. Wells?
One of my goals with the book, Ida B. the Queen, was to introduce Ida to a younger audience. There are some people who are not familiar with her story, and in order to make her story relevant and contemporary, I thought it would be a good idea to show that the work that she did and the legacy that she left for all of us is being continued by other people. And to show that nobody lives in a bubble. Nobody lives in this vacuum of history. And so Ida was influenced by people and experiences and events that happened before her. And then people have continued on what she was doing after her. So it shows the whole arc of the African American experience.
Mm-hmm. And there's one, I don't know exactly where the passage is, but it's one line where you talk about the importance of African Americans reclaiming our own narrative and telling our own story and telling it in the way that we would tell it rather than letting other people tell it or trying to clean up our stories. Sometimes I think we fall into that trap. How do you see um, what's the injury, what's the damage that's happening in the culture, in the African American culture, because we tend not to always tell our stories, and we tend to think that somebody else will tell the story, and the story doesn't get told, or it doesn't get told in the best way. How do you see that happening now? Where are places where clearly we need to be telling our own story and we're not?
I mean, I think that's a kind of mixed. I have a mixed answer because I think that there are a lot of people out here who are telling our story and filling in the gaps. For instance, when it comes to the suffrage movement, I'll give one example. With the suffrage movement, you know, for the longest time, the story of the suffrage movement was very focused on maybe 5 white women. And so if you only hear that story of these certain women, you would think that there were not thousands of women involved in the suffrage movement, and you wouldn't know that there were women of color the way that the story has been told most of the time. And so what I've seen is there's an enormous amount of effort. Maybe it's more in the academic world, but you have to start somewhere with it when it comes to primary sources, to bring the stories of the African American women and other women of color out of the margins, out of the asterisks and the footnotes, and into the full story of the suffrage movement. So in that way, especially because last year was the centennial of the 19th Amendment, there were a lot of books that were published last year, a lot of conferences and events, exhibits, and all that to show and tell that story. However, you know, there are always certain, you know, communities or certain individuals that are harder to reach. So, you know, that's my goal with this book and some of the other things that I'm working on, is to make these stories available to everybody.
I was really fascinated by, I think it's the letter from Frederick Douglas to her, you know, and you kind of get I hadn't gotten a really good feel about like friendship and appreciation from somebody like Frederick Douglass to Ida B. Wells, and maybe I've just missed that in the things I've read. But was there more than just that? That letter is very. Can you just maybe just share with the audience so they know what we're talking about? But the letter really struck me as being very respectful and appreciative in a way that I've never quite perceived that as the relationship that would have existed because of all the, you know, the competition and stuff that went on in our society between men and women and people who were powerful and kind of sometimes I guess seen as rivals, maybe even, but just say a little bit about that.
Right. Well, I mean, I found that interesting. Frederick Douglass really he became a mentor figure, father figure, however you want to call it. He was about 45 years older than my great grandmother. So he definitely, when you read through, like, there were several letters exchanged between them. I only included one in the book, but there was definitely this sense that he was paving the way for her. He was providing opportunities for her. He was giving recommendations for her, speaking on her behalf. It was just amazing. He really was very generous. They met at a press conference in the late 1880s, and he had already read some of her writing at that point. So because her work was reprinted in other newspapers around the country, but he took it upon himself to reach out to her regarding her writing. After that letter, what happened was that she had written about what happened regarding lynching in Memphis and other places, and so he wrote her a letter saying that he appreciated the information that she conveyed in her writings, and she had opened his eyes to what the reality of lynching was, because he had actually, Frederick Douglass had actually started to believe some of the false narratives because they were so pervasive, criminalizing Black people when they really weren't, committing any kind of crimes. One last thing about Frederick Douglass is that my family credits him with introducing my great-grandparents.
Oh, really? Oh, how about that? Well, and it was so delightful to see that letter and to hear that story, and now to hear more about that. And that was one of the other things that was so delightful about the book, was to have that letter there, or, to have some of these other little historical photographs of historical documents here, along with the modern day renditions of different figures. I mean, this is just so brilliant to put something together, because it's so engaging. And you think you're past being a little kid that likes picture books, but it's just great having these representations of the figures that really mean a lot to us. And having, I read the letter and I thought, now, isn't this wonderful? And I'd never had a window into that relationship before, between her and Frederick Douglass. I want to ask you a little bit about, you talked about reading her diary to kind of get a better sense about her. I really found reading the Memphis Diary one of the most delightful reads I've had in a very long time, because I saw Ida B. Wells, the person, rather than the giant that you kind of. And can you say a little bit about how the diary was for you, or how do you make sure you help people let her be a person, as well as not taking anything away from the extraordinary way in which she lived her life? How is that something that you think about much, or can you say a little bit about that?
Yes, well, one of my goals with this book was to humanize my great-grandmother. I wanted people to learn about all of the extraordinary things that she did as a suffragist and a journalist and anti-lynching crusader and civil rights activist, and co-founder of the NAACP, and just, I mean, the number of achievements that she had are unbelievable, just extraordinary. But I also wanted to present her in a way that I always sought out, because I knew all of those achievements that she, had. But for me, I was like, well, was she ever afraid? Did she ever have any self-doubt? Did she ever feel, disappointed? Those are the things I wanted to know, so that I could connect to her in a way as I was, on my journey to adulthood and through my adulthood. That's what made me feel like, if I knew that she had those type of emotional responses to what was going on and she overcame them, then that made me feel like, well, okay, so she had the same feelings that I do, and maybe I can overcome things the way she did. So it just, for me, was a source of connecting with her as from one woman to another, living a century apart. And my hope is that other people, when they read through this, they will have the same level of connection to her as a human being, a fully fleshed out, multidimensional person.
Right. I so appreciate that, because I think that we're so preoccupied with heroism, and then that person's almost not a human being. And of course, it lets us off the hook for being whoever it is we are too, because if you're so way up here somewhere, I don't have to worry about trying to be there, because after all, you're so much different from me. And I think that trying to humanize people who are willing to be courageous and listen to the call upon their lives as she did it's so encouraging. Just like you said, that if you can do this as this human being with your frailties, then maybe there's hope for me. And I loved reading about her, guys that she liked that didn't like her, or and she would say things like, well, like there's something wrong with them. She put it on them if they didn't see her for who she really was, and shopping and liking dresses. And I thought, yeah, because I like my handbags and all these things, and just kind of seeing that quality of humanity is just so delightful, and the balance that it brings then, and I think can give you some hope that, yeah, you could stand up and be counted. How do you think she managed to be so courageous, though? I mean, and just, here you go across the land and they've got bounties on your head, and you are considered to be the worst, what was it the FBI said, one of the most dangerous people in the United States. And I'm thinking, really, so what do you think accounted for that kind of in spite of it, in the face of all of those possibilities of danger and physical harm, to just keep on going?
Based on what she wrote in her autobiography, which is what, she wrote her autobiography towards the end of her life. So that, gave me an opportunity to see the whole, arc of her life, versus her diary was written for only 2 years when she was in her 20s. So my, conclusion that I came through, so trying to read between the lines, because she was very deliberate about what she included in her autobiography. There are some gaping omissions, which which are sort of frustrating. So it puts the reader, me, and everybody else who reads that into a position where you're trying to figure out, what could have happened, that she must have made a choice to not include. But one of those is, what kept her going. She didn't really talk about it in very plain terms, but I could, reading through the lines and sort of coming to my own conclusions, is that it was personal. It really came across as personal. With her, she was, on fire after her friends were murdered. That's what really sparked her activism. It was like she was on a rampage, or like on a life mission to tell the whole world about this atrocity that happened. And then, as a woman, she suffered indignities. And so, she personally, suffered indignities. And so to me, a lot of what drove her was the personal experiences that she had with the inequities and the indignities that she, and the violence that she actually had either experienced herself, or she investigated numerous lynchings, and was just mortified at what this country was really doing to its own citizens.
And her absolute unrelenting stand against lynching has been so empowering to me, and so has helped me in my quest to remember the lynched in Georgia. We have a memorial at our center with all the names of everybody who was lynched in Georgia on that memorial, because we need to do that. We need to bring them back into the community with some sense of, we're sorry about what happened to you, and we care. And I've caught myself thinking, I think I might be channeling Ida B. Wells a little bit around this, So do you have any sense about, for yourself, in terms of things that you find yourself doing, that you are that the energy is somehow connected to her, that it's you're kind of on this path because you've got this legacy and you've got this person, and that she is present in whatever ways our ancestors can be present to us? Do you have any?
Well, the way that I think about I have my own personal interest that were not influenced by anybody pressuring me. And I wasn't on this quest to live up to somebody else's life or legacy. It's just, for whatever reason, I just have this personal interest in telling our stories, I really, I mean, in high school, I was on the newspaper staff. I was on the yearbook staff, not because I was trying to be like my great grandmother, but I really wanted to tell our stories. And as I've grown, from my teenage years to now where I am, I've just been very focused on telling the full, complete, multidimensional Black American experience. Because I have had several, situations that were sparked when I was in college specifically, where I realized the power of imagery and messaging and media, and I just felt really determined to do what I can as one person to contribute to telling the full African American experience, because from what I experienced, there were too many false narratives, a lot of really misconceptions about who Black people are and how we live, and I just feel the need to correct that.
Yes, and thank you for that, because that's so important, and I think that African Americans and women and other people of color have to take responsibility to set the record straight if we want the record cleared up. I mean, you can't, the people who have created the false narrative, you can't expect that they're going to go back and fix it, because if they would, it wouldn't have been done in a false way in the first place. And so that I mean, I think that's sort of like being ridiculous. I mean, why we talk about revisionist history. Well, the revisionist historian is not going to go revise him or herself, because they already wrote that book and everybody's quoting them everywhere. And so I think you're so right. So I really appreciate that you have that determination, and then to link why is it important for us to make this link, that the link that you make here with, having Bree on the flagpole and Ida B. Wells in the beginning of the book? Why is that important?
Well, I mean, my great-grandmother worked in various ways. I mean, she was a journalist, and so she was writing about what was going on, and with the idea to educate the public and try and basically create a court of public, to create a documentation so that the atrocities that were happening could be tried in the court of public opinion, because she knew that the law was not going to be on our side. And because several times when she documented it, the people who were part of the legal system were the perpetrators of the crimes. So how can you get justice if the judge and the sheriff and the attorneys are the criminals?
And the jurors.
Yeah. So, she was like, there's no way, so let's just take it to the public. And also she had strategies of boycotts. So she wanted to hurt people financially for what was happening. And so she encouraged boycotts. She encouraged a boycott of the streetcar system in Memphis after her friends were killed, and then boycotting white-owned businesses. And then for those who could leave Memphis, she encouraged people to physically just leave and go to some other parts of the country where they would have more opportunity to live in a more free way without terrorism. And so when I was connecting what's happening currently, I was thinking about all of the different strategies and the ways that my great-grandmother worked. One was taking a stand alone. And that's what Bree Newsom did. She, as one individual person, decided to take it upon herself to take down the flag, the South Carolina flag. And so, because it was offensive to her and many other people, and instead of waiting and waiting and waiting for this, empty promises, she, as one person, decided to do that. And that's what my great-grandmother did several times. She stood alone in her convictions, and even though she knew that she would suffer repercussions. So, there are several examples that I have of how she worked. She organized, she worked alone, she used her voice as a journalist. So there are several ways that her strategies were quite varied.
Yes, and I think, you know, the courage of with the Women's March, when they didn't want her to be, they didn't want the Black women to march with the white women, and she just wasn't having it, and it was sort of like it just wasn't going to happen. That she was going to be there, and she was going to be where she wanted to be, and she was, and they did nothing about it, because what can you do about it? And I think that's I mean, once you stand, you've stood. Like when Bree took the flag down, it was down, you know. You could stand there and talk to yourself about it, but the flag was down, and I guess it hasn't been put back up. I don't know if they did or not, but I know that it stirred up the pot that was not stirred before in some new ways, actually. So Michelle, do you have a favorite story about your great grandmother that is of all? I mean, there are lots. I know there are lots of them, but is there anything that's particularly your favorite?
One story that my family, we kind of always joked about was how persistent Ferdinand was in attracting Ida. We just found that to be kind of hilarious. That he was a widower, and he had 2 children from his previous marriage. And Ida came to Chicago to work on the pamphlet that was distributed at the World's Fair. And they were working together, and that's how we credit Frederick Douglass with introducing them, because it was his brainchild to work on this pamphlet, and they were working together. So they obviously hit it off and got along. And we just joke that he proposed to her multiple times, and I guess she doesn't talk about it in her book, but we just imagine that she was like, "Yeah, I'm busy. I have stuff to do," and he was persistent. And after she finally agreed to marry him, she still went on an extensive speaking tour, both to England for 4 months and then across the United States. So he waited for like 2 years before they got married. And the whole time she was traveling. He was very patient.
Yes, and a marriage that was definitely meant to be, I think. You know, that's pretty interesting. I think when I think about just as the outsider who came to meet this person when I was a lot younger, and then to have thought about her a whole lot, that I love the story of her on the train, and making it difficult for those guys to get her off the train. But my favorite story is about her taking on the caretaking of her siblings at the death of her parents, because for me that just says so much about a youngster, and how much we need to encourage young people and not sell them short, because we don't know what they can do, you know. So you are a teacher, and you teach in a college, and you teach younger people, I guess, of traditional students. Is maybe, I don't know what group levels, but what do you see in them that gives you hope when you think about them in relationship to the things, to the past and the present, and the things we have to do? And I mean this question to think about both Black and white and brown students. What do you see that gives you hope, and what do you see that cause you concern?
Oh, well, my students, I teach college, and most of them are between the ages, I'm guessing, of 20. I mean, the traditional 18 to 22. There are some, a few that are maybe a little older, but they're still probably mostly under 25. And well, the last 2 elections, presidential elections, have been very interesting for me to watch how the students are engaged in the political system. And one thing that's been very heartwarming is how active they've been. Some of the students were very involved in, campaigning for certain candidates. They would go to the rallies, they would go to, register voters. they were very into it. And sometimes they would come to class so geeked up about some of the things that they had, just seen or that they were involved in, that I was like, okay, let's just take a moment, in the class to talk about this, because we do have an outside world outside of the classroom. And so I've always been very impressed with how knowledgeable the students are about so many issues that do affect their lives, and have been very, I mean, not all, but I'm just saying, there are definitely enough of the students that are very engaged. I think that as a society, we don't give the younger generation as much credit as they deserve, because there are a number of these students that are really, I'm looking forward to seeing what they end up doing in life.
Yeah, I love teaching. I loved teaching. I don't want to grade papers anymore, so I'm retired from doing that. But I do think I agree with you completely about the underestimation of what the young folks have to bring to the table, and we need their gifts so much. And I was so amazed about the recent expressions of activism around police killings, and this past year, that the mobilization of young people all over the globe seemed to be a bit different from what it's been in the past. And it was very encouraging to see that, because I think we went through a cycle when they kind of thought we messed up the world so badly when it was unfixable and they might as well just go do something else. But I think that's shifted a lot, and that's really encouraging.
I mean, I'm in Chicago. I don't know how it is in other cities, but in Chicago, these students are fired up. And I mean, not just the students that I teach, but I've seen a lot of people in that same age group that are very engaged. I think they just want something different than what has been presented to them, and feel they have a voice. And I think some of it could be the technology, because they're empowered with all of these different platforms and are really skilled at using them.
Absolutely. Yes. So one last question before we invite the audience to start having input. I wanted to ask, I think that we see signs that Ida B. Wells is getting some of the recognition that she deserves around the country with, various, I mean, there've been monuments and things before, but there's been more of that, and street namings, and the Pulitzer posthumous recognition. How I know you've been involved in some of that, but how does that feel? How does that feel? That's the question, not to you now as you do your work and as you look at how others who kind of out there in another arena are paying attention to her.
Thanks for asking that, Catherine. Actually, I've been involved in quite a few public history projects around, commemorating the contributions of my great-grandmother. And there are several that are going on, that are being developed around the country. There are several that have been developed in Chicago, and still one in the works. But one of the things about my book, I'd Be the Queen, that I'm hoping will sort of be connected to the public history projects, is that people, I see them as complementing each other, because people can read the book and learn about her life and her legacy and how her work fits into the whole continuum of the Black experience. But then also, when they're in public spaces, can see, these tributes to her and understand where she fits. And then vice versa. If people have never heard of her before and they see these public tributes to her, then they can, pique their interest in learning more, and read about her. So I think people learn in different ways, and people are inspired in different ways. And so I think all of these tributes and all of this work is important.
Yes, and I'm glad to see it myself. I have just so you know, I have two pictures of her here in the room where I work, and one on my bedroom wall and one on my wall at the office, because I always want to be reminded of her, along with my mother and Mary McLeod Bethune, and just that cloud of witnesses, that a lot of those women that are such a great cloud of witnesses for all of us. So, well, you ready for us to take some questions from somebody other than me? And ER, if you want to come back and ask and help us know what folks have been having on their minds while they've been listening to us.
Yes. So I want to let folks know you can keep putting questions in here. So if other stuff comes up, feel free. But we have a great first question. So this comes from Tiffany, and Tiffany says, "Hello, I'm an Atlanta area journalist and have considered Ida B. Wells my hero throughout my career. I was wondering, what actions do you think she would take as a journalist in this era? What stories would she pursue, and what issues would she champion?" And then another person asked a very similar question. So what can you talk about what issues you feel she would be drawn to today? So what actions do you think she would take as a journalist in this era, and what stories would she pursue, and what issues would she champion?
I can answer that question by talking about what she did do. She was a journalist. She was a pioneer in data journalism, where she chronicled and documented exact names, locations, circumstances, dates of people who were lynched. She would interview people who were either witnesses or somehow affected by the lynching. So she humanized the statistics that were going on at that time. And really, from my perspective, she was building a case. It was almost like she was building a legal case by collecting all of this data and then putting it together into pamphlets in order to try this country in the court of public opinion. And she did that even overseas. I mean, that's part of the reason what she was doing when she went over to England and the United Kingdom. She had gathered all of these facts and was presenting them to people outside of the country to indict the United States of what this country was doing to their own citizens, and with absolutely no justice for literally murdering people. And she also obviously fought, for women to have the right to vote. So we still have a ways to go when it comes to racial and gender equity. So more than likely she would be, doing the same type of things. It's just kind of morphed a little bit from, we're not, having people paraded through towns on platforms and burned alive today like they were during her time. But we still have our own version of injustice and criminal behavior that is not being punished. So more than likely she would be interested in the same type of topics.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So our next question comes from Sanders. Did she have a particular political party affiliation? How did she engage political parties at all or work around them?
Right. Well, my great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells, was involved with the Republican Party at that time, which people really need to understand that the Democrat and the Republican parties were very different during my great-grandmother's lifetime than they are today. They were almost exactly the opposite of what they are today. And so she was very involved in, at that time, the Republican Party was progressive. It was about more focused on justice and moving forward to create opportunities that were more about racial equity. And so that was the party that she was affiliated with. The other party, which is today considered more progressive, was absolute segregationist. So it was literally almost like the exact opposite of what we have today.
Yeah.
Regime asks says, in Columbus, Georgia, the people are not fired up, and I find myself alone on the streets. How are ways to reach them? They are in the understanding that happened so long ago. So I think, asking basically, how do I get people fired up? Kind of using Ida B. Wells as a model.
One thing that my hope that people get from the book is the various ways that my great-grandmother worked. There were many times when she worked alone. And one of the things that I wanted people to get from the book is how frustrated she was at times, and how she, was discouraged at times. It wasn't like she just, was always, in the straight path and everything was nice and easy. She had a lot of disappointments, a lot of setbacks. And that's one thing that was very apparent in, well, actually the diary, but also even in her autobiography, she recounts several situations where she was just devastated by the lack of support that she was expecting. So my advice, if you want to follow my great-grandmother's example, just be okay with being alone. Because she was alone at times and was okay with going alone.
And then finally, Pamela Inskeep asks, how would she feel about the young rising poet, the poet laureate, Amanda Gorman? What words of encouragement would you or she give to Amanda and other young adults today?
Well, considering my great-grandmother, when I read through her diary, she was a very big fan of, she loved the theater. She went to lectures quite a bit. She was part of what were called lyceums at that time, which were sort of like social literary clubs where people would gather and do staged readings. They would read poetry and read prose. And so she was involved in a community of people who were expressing themselves in written and spoken word. So since that was her, what she would do outside of her job in her social world, I'm sure she would be very impressed with Amanda Gorman and, encourage people to continue expressing themselves in that way. Because you see my great-grandmother started in that world and she followed what she enjoyed. And I think that's important. That's one thing I try to even tell my students is like, go for what you're interested in, go for what fulfills you, even if it doesn't pay, because that's another thing that she experienced and she's very clear about that when she first started writing, she was not paid one penny. She was paid with copies of the newspapers. So, you have to be willing to do those kind of things just in order to be true to yourself.
And then when she did get paid, it was the big sum of 10 cents, right? For her first
I think it was $1 a week.
Yeah, so it was really not enough money to do anything with, even in that day. So
no.
Nobody's ever gotten rich doing this kind of work. Avery O. Williams asks, is there a movie in the works about Ida B. Wells?
Oh, Avery. I actually know Avery. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see. We'll see what happens. There's been a lot of interest in having a movie made about her. People tell me all the time, oh, there should be a movie about her. And so a lot of people want to see a movie made. So we'll just have to see what happens.
Yeah. That would be fantastic to have, I think.
So this is
the last question.
That's the last question. There's a great comment here in the chat that I want y'all to hear, which is Michelle says, thank you. My niece is named Ida after your great-grandmother. I have bought your book for her to grow up with and get to know her namesake in your unique offering. She is 6 years old. Take care. So wanted to make sure you saw that. But that's all our.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so that's all of our questions. So, Dr. Meeks, if you have a few more, feel free.
Yeah. Well, Michelle, you got a little more energy? You want to
Oh,
talk a little
absolutely.
more? Oh, okay. Well, I think it might be wonderful to talk a little bit about Ida B's commitment to gender equality. We talk about the lynching work so much, but she really stood up for gender equality and for Black women to be free. And I'm just thinking about her involvement with Susan B. Anthony and those women, and how Anthony was so uh, dismissive. I think didn't have much of a sense of who Ida B was actually as a person, but that didn't stop Ida B from being involved with them, because that was important to try to work to change, make life better for Black women, and to have people understand Black women were not free too. So I don't know how, when you think about her work around that and then around race, I think that I can remember, like in the 60s, it was always this tug of war, particularly the guys saying, when the women started caring about gender issues, it was because we were being too influenced by white women. And then white women don't quite really get what Black women were up against with in that whole arena. So I know you've done a good bit of work around some of that. So I wondered if you might want to say a little bit about her understanding and what that legacy is for us, and how we might touch into that more, even because we do tend to, I think, talk a whole lot about the lynching part, which is great and certainly there in what she did, but her passion was quite there for gender equality too.
Right. Well, my great-grandmother was one of the co-founders of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs in 1896, which was founded to address what you just said. I mean, gender equity, but also it was both, because Black women were not necessarily welcome into women's clubs that were dominated by white women, and so Black women took it upon themselves to create their own clubs, because Black women's experiences were unique, because you're dealing with racism and sexism. So in that way, she was involved in sort of a collective way of addressing the issues of her time when it came to being a double minority, if you want to consider it that. One way that is illustrated in particular when it comes to gender is when, after she founded the Alpha Suffrage Club in 1913 and was canvassing for women to register to vote, she had to appeal to their husbands, because too many, several of the men were like, oh, well, what does my wife have to, do with voting? And, people saying, well, the woman is wearing the pants in the family and that kind of thing. And so she had to convince the men that, well, if your wife has the right to vote, then we as a community can have more power to have control over our own destinies, because we can vote in a Black man as the first, and that actually happened. Oscar DePriest was elected as the first Black alderman of the Second Ward in Chicago. But she couldn't. I mean, I'm not saying a blanket statement for every single woman, but she does talk in her book about how the strategy to get women to register to vote was to also convince her husband, the woman's husband, that this was not a threat to him. It was not a threat to manhood for the woman to vote.
Yeah, and that goes back to what you were saying earlier about how all the different ways that she worked, and the willingness to understand that the most important thing is to get the task done, and that you use the tools in front of you, you use the tools you have, and whether that's being by yourself or being with a group, or being a woman activist for gender equality who talks to men to help them make that happen. I mean, that's just really smart that you would have that kind of attitude. So I think. So is there anything else that you would like us to talk about that I have not thought about here as I've been asking you all these millions of questions? At some point that you really want to make sure people don't miss that we haven't touched on?
I mean, I would just basically repeat myself a little bit as far as the goal of the book is to, introduce people to Ida's life and legacy and her work, and understand how the work that she was doing fits into the 400-year history of African Americans in this country, and to also understand how her legacy has been continued in various ways by different individual people and movements. So, my hope with the book is that people will see that every generation has its own individual challenges, and addresses the issues of their time in the way that they can. And so we're all sort of building on each other until we one day will all, have, equity and equality in this country.
Yes, and I think to have that kind of hope and is respectful of the ancestors' legacy too, because it was hope and courage and grit and a whole bunch of things that helped them to leave us the legacy that they left us, and we deserve to hold it with hopefulness and to build on it. So, and I'm just deeply honored to be having had this opportunity to have this conversation with you, and then to know that you're going to be coming back to be with us a little bit later in this spring during Women's History Month, and we will continue to be holding up this wonderful banner of Ida B. Wells, but we'll be holding it up by doing exactly what your parents taught you to do, trying to be the best person we can be, and not trying to be little carbon copies of Ida B. Wells, which would be a great mistake, as we have been talking about. So I don't have any more questions. I could talk to you a lot longer if we were just sitting down with a great cup of tea. So maybe we'll get that opportunity when in a post-COVID era. But this has been so delightful for me. I've been excited all day like a little girl waiting to have this conversation. So yeah, because I do love your great-grandmother. I tell you that. So, and appreciate her, and just appreciate the way that you have been handling her. You've respectfully helping her to be enlarged in ways, but doing it within the context of your own journey and your own work. And that's really something to be commended too, because you could do that in ways that wouldn't be as honoring as I think you're doing it. So thank you so much for that.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much. And Catherine, thank you for all the work you're doing to help people learn and be inspired by my great-grandmother's story. So I appreciate all of your work.
Yeah, well, she's dearly loved and appreciated and respected. So ER, what other things instructions do you have to give to people?
Well, thank you. The most important one is that we want everybody to buy Ida B. the Queen, The Extraordinary Life and Legacy of Ida B. Wells via this little teal button down at the bottom center of your screen. So I hope if you don't have it yet, I trust that tonight's conversation will make you know that you need to have this book, either for yourself or also for a young person in your life. The nice thing about this book is it's very accessible. So a young person can read it all the way on up. So I think it's a nice family book. And so we want people of all ages to get with it. So check that out, this teal button. The Kirkus is primarily individually donor sponsored. So we always Remind folks of that and just say we appreciate any donations you are able to give, $5, $10, anything. We also know everybody's money is all over the place right now during this pandemic, so we're just glad you're here with us. All of our events are always free, so we're happy you're here. We want to thank our folks at the Auburn Avenue Research Library. Y'all have, as always, been dropping amazing links. Feel free, anyone who's watching, to just scroll back up and go through these links. You can also just revisit this URL at any time, and the links will still be here for you. Finally, we will be repackaging this with captions, and you'll be able to watch this on YouTube. So if you have any friends who really wanted to be here tonight, but they couldn't be here, I'll have it back up on YouTube. Our YouTube is just /Kirkus Circle by the end of the weekend. So please check that out as well and let folks know. So I know a lot of folks maybe we're out and about tonight, so we would love for more people to hear this wonderful conversation. So thank you so much to both of you. This was so educational and really gave us a warm sense of who your great-grandmother was. So I'm very grateful to you both.
And thanks to everybody for the amazing comments and the all of the words of gratitude to us. Thank you all very much.
Yes. Everybody stay safe. Take care. Good night.
Thank you, Michelle. See you in a month.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.